Welcome to week 8 of the Transition to Organic webinar series for crop producers. We have two wonderful speakers who will be discussing organic pest and disease management today. This series is a collaboration between the Community Alliance with Family Farmers, UC Cooperative Extension, and the UC Organic Agriculture Institute. I'm Grace Jackson, the Farmer Services Central Valley Regional Lead at CAF. I'm going to pass it over to Margaret Lloyd to introduce herself.
Thank you. Hi, I'm Margaret Lloyd, and I'm the Small Farms Advisor for UC Cooperative Extension, serving Yolo, Solano, and Sacramento counties. Thank you.
And hi, everyone. My name is Katharina Ullman. I am the Training and Technical Assistance Coordinator with the UC Organic Agriculture Institute. And so excited to see you all here today and really, really looking forward to the presentations today. And I'll pass it back to Grace.
Thanks, y'all. We want to take a quick moment to thank our funders for making this series possible. The CDFA Office of Agricultural Resilience and Sustainability, CDFA's State Organic Program, and the USDA Transition to Organic Partnership Program. We have our weekly structure presented here. We will start soon and get into the presentations. We are saving some time at the end for Q&A, and we'll wrap things up around 1:15 with a closing poll. We welcome and invite everyone on here to stay with us from 1:15 to 2 p.m. for office hours with Eric Middleton. And this is where we really get into, a lot of the kind of interesting discussion part of this webinar series. You can download the weekly we can download the webinar series resource guide to access weekly presentations, resources, and optional OSP homework if you are following along with that. And with that, I'm going to pass it on to Katharina, who will introduce our speakers for today.
Thanks so much, Grace. So as we've said, today we're going to be learning about pest and disease management on organic farms. So we're in week 8 of this 10-week series. I'm now very excited to introduce the two speakers that we have with us. We'll first hear about organic disease management from Margaret Lloyd. For the past 10 years, Margaret has served as the UC Cooperative Extension Small Farm Advisor in Yolo, Solano, and Sacramento counties. She leads research and extension programming for diversified and organic farmers. Her PhD is in plant pathology, and she has a master's in international agricultural development and 8 years of experience working on small organic farms. And all of these experiences together help shape her program, one rooted in practical, science-based participatory extension. Thank you so much for joining us, Margaret. Before I hand it to Margaret, I also wanted to introduce the other speaker. So after Margaret, I'm really happy to say that Eric Middleton will be here presenting on organic pest management. Eric is an IPM advisor serving San Diego, Orange, and Los Angeles counties. He works on managing insect pests in perennial fruit crops, nursery, and ornamental production, and in landscapes of all kinds. So thank you so much for being here, Eric. And with that, we'll go ahead and stop sharing our screens and pass it over to Margaret to give her presentation. And Margaret, I can see your presentation and your slideshow. Thanks so much.
All right. Thank you. You can hear me okay, I take it. So thanks for being here, everybody. I'm happy to be talking about managing diseases in organic production today. as a plant pathologist, it's always fun to be able to talk about plant diseases. So getting into this topic, I think it's really important to remember that most plants are healthy and that disease is typically a response to conditions that support disease. And that can be from the plant, the environment, or the status of the pathogen. So disease is not the norm and is the exception. So with that, let's think a little bit more about diseases. The principles of disease management are rooted in the disease triangle, which is shown here. So in order for plant disease to occur, you need to have all three conditions: a susceptible host, the right environmental conditions for the pathogen, and you have to have the pathogen. And so when we think about managing diseases, we're managing all three, or at least one of those parts of this triangle. And the way I like to think about these is when we think about the host, the pathogen, we're trying to keep inoculum levels low. With the plant, we're trying to optimize plant health or have resistant plants. And in the environment, create a less favorable environment for the pathogen. So integrated disease management in non-chemical and organic production has multiple components that we will go through one by one. The first is sanitation, exclusion, and prevention. Using resistant or tolerant varieties. Crop rotation, especially with non-host crops. Treatments that aim to reduce the pathogen populations. Destruction of the infected crop debris. In-season management, so having good management that reduces stress and biological control. And interestingly, that list is the same whether you're organic or conventional. And so these principles of disease management are universal. There's just a couple sort of angles that change. So first, synthetic chemicals are typically more effective at killing the pathogen, and they tend to be cheaper. And so this affects how one might prioritize or approach all the other practices. Organic farmers must do a better job at all those other practices because they don't have as effective and as cheap fallback options. And so it's critical to be vigilant, to act early, and to use many practices. So I'm going to go through each of these, but I will kind of take a more cursory approach to it, since I'm trying to introduce the practices to demonstrate the range of practices that organic growers have access to, as opposed to teaching more details about how to use these practices. But I hope you have enough information to get that big picture of the tools that are available to organic growers and the role that they play in pest management. So the first one is sanitation, exclusion, and prevention. So this is focused on the pathogen, keeping that pathogen out of your farm or not letting its populations get really high. And I have this figure here, which shows the disease incidence of a plant, in this case, strawberry, and the amount of the pathogen in the soil. So this is Verticillium dahliae. And what you'll see is that you can have a significant amount of the pathogen in the soil before disease actually occurs or occurs in a significant way. And I bring this up because it's within this less than 100 microscopic per gram soil that a farmer is trying to keep the pathogens. And so it highlights the importance of management and keeping inoculum levels low, and that there is wiggle room in pathogen management. And it also points out that when disease outbreak occurred, once the pathogen levels reached higher levels, it wasn't that the pathogen just showed up typically. Rather, those pathogen populations existed at low levels, and it wasn't until they got to higher levels and or the conditions, the environmental conditions were correct, such that a disease outbreak took place. So it's important to keep those inoculum levels low, and that's done primarily through sanitation, exclusion, and prevention practices. Sanitation. So here's just an example of one of many ways in which tools spread inoculum. So here we have a bunch of stakes coming out of a tomato field. You can see that there is soil caked onto these stakes. So if this was in a field with soil-borne pathogens, those pathogens could be on these stakes and then introduced to a new field. So in this next slide, you can see that here's the untreated control. So this is the fusarium loads, this is the pathogen, and on the bottom, this is the treatment. And this was for cleaning of a tomato harvester. So it's tomato harvesters going through harvesting tomatoes. It's picking up dirt along the way, like any equipment that runs through fields. So in the untreated control, when they cleaned off that dirt, they found high loads of fusarium. If that equipment was cleaned just using air, you can see how significantly it reduced the fusarium loads. And if you add water, it reduced it even further. You can ignore the rest of this graph because these are not allowable in organics. But my point is that even using air and water, you can significantly reduce the pathogens in equipment. So sanitation is key. Another common sanitation practice is using certified disease-free tomatoes or seeds or plant material of any kind. Pathogens do come in on seeds. So Verticillium dahliae was causing problems in the strawberry industry, and it was discovered that rotations with spinach were what were importing the pathogen to the field and then causing disease in strawberries. So always having certified clean seed. And if you're saving seeds, be sure that you're treating your seeds. You can use hot water or bleach as part of that surface sterilization technique. And doing common practices like removing plants that appear to be unhealthy. So that's part of the vigilance and attention to detail early on. Some pathogens, specifically viruses, can be transmitted by insects. So excluding insects can be a tool for reducing viral infections, and that can be done using different types of netting. Resistant cultivars. This is a really important tool for managing diseases in both conventional and organics. Here's an example of grafting. So when you don't have resistant varieties, you could graft them in potentially. Rotating with crops that do not have the same host range of the pathogen that you're trying to control. And in general, rotating prevents the accumulation of pathogens in the soil. I'm going to skip through this. So treatments, there are chemical controls. The most effective and common ones for pathogens are copper, sulfur, and copper sulfate. And to a lesser extent, there are biological control products. This is the bug in a jug approach. And they have mixed efficacy, but they are also available. To a lesser extent, the neem oils and horticultural oils, in general, insecticides that are killing insects that might be transmitting viruses are part of the toolkit, but to a lesser extent. Once you have the pathogen, you might need to actually knock back those levels. And so those chemicals are a way to do it when they're on the plant, but once they're in the soil or have become established in other ways, you can treat the soil using soil solarization. This also is effective at managing weeds. One can use steam. And so this is steam that's run through that tube and covered with a heavy tarp that kills pathogens by pasteurizing. It also kills weed seeds. Anaerobic soil disinfestation is another way to treat the soil to kill the pathogen. Pathogens live, soil-borne pathogens and some others live in the residue. And so whether you have a disease outbreak or you have minor disease in the field, making sure that residue fully decomposes and decomposes quickly is an important tool for suppressing these pathogens that live in or on the surface of residue. Number 6, in-season management. So optimizing plant health and reducing stress. This is a reminder of the importance of maintaining health as a disease prevention tool. So this includes fertility, making sure optimum levels are there, and water management, etc. Here's an example of providing shade for peppers. So this reduces stress to the plant. It increases yield, but it likely reduces the incidence of disease because the plants are less stressed. So here we bring the disease triangle together with these different practices. And you can see how in this triangle, different practices are addressing the host, pathogen, or the environment. And so we're going after all in different angles to manage disease. Again, the most plants are healthy, and that's our focus. And number 7 is really an important part for organic producers. And with the many producers I've worked with, when we ask them about how they manage diseases in organics, they'll often say that they focus on healthy soil. And this is really cueing in on the biological controls that exist in the soil, along with plant health. So there are 4 main mechanisms that biological control works in the soil. The first one is antagonism or antibiosis. And so here you have a pythium spore, and here you have the root. On the root, you can have beneficial soil microorganisms. In this case, Bacillus pseudolus. This is one that you could buy a bug in the jug. It also exists naturally in the soil. And so this pythium spore is hanging out in the soil looking for the root. This beneficial microbe produces an antibiotic that can then kill the zoospore. A second example is competition for nutrients. So this pythium spore and many other soil-borne pathogens germinate and grow towards seeds or roots based on chemical cues that are exudated from the seeds or the roots. In this case, linoleic acid stimulates that pathogen. So if you have other microbes in the soil that interfere with the communication of this acid to this pathogen, then that pathogen stays dormant in the soil. And this happens by general competition. So having more organisms in the soil, competing for resources, and colonizing the roots or seeds. So that's a second way. Parasitism. So trichoderma is a very famous soil microbial biological control organism. Trichoderma can attack pythium and poke holes into it. Trichoderma is a fungal organism, which is very abundant naturally. And that signaling is what attracts or detracts insects from visiting plants. Here's an example of some data showing how when vermicompost was added to a soil, it led to a decrease, well, in this case, an increase of the visitation by beneficial insects, which was in response to an attack by aphids. And they showed that with the addition of vermicompost, there was increased signaling of these volatiles from those leaves that had been triggered by the microbes in the vermicompost and encouraged green lacewings to land on the plant. So, in summary, these biological controls, which are basically beneficial soil microbes, can prevent soil-borne pathogens from causing disease and have other impacts that influence the pattern and behavior of insects. So these are really important mechanisms that are happening in the soil. And they're rooted in these principles of soil health. So these are the 4 principles that are promoted by the NRCS and other organizations. And this idea is that soil health is the capacity of soil to function as a vital living system. And sometimes plant disease gets forgotten in this discussion of soil health, but it's so implicit that soil health and plant health implies the absence of disease or minimization of disease. So we have soil armor or cover, minimizing soil disturbance, plant diversity, and continual live plants or roots. So all of these are protecting the soil. And I want to highlight an aspect that is somewhat missing, but is a little bit hidden in those 4 practices, which is feeding the soil. So thinking about the importance of feeding the soil and protecting the soil as a way to feed that soil life. So cover crops or any roots and plant residue is feeding the soil. And so reducing or minimizing these fallow periods. Oh, sorry.
Hey, Margaret, you have about 5 minutes left.
Thank you. Adding soil amendments like compost that add soil organic matter and create habitat and food for soil microbes. And animal integration is also a way to add food for the soil and to, in some ways, reduce disturbance. Now, when you switch to really focusing on building the biology in the soil, which can happen during organic transition, this takes time. And the soil food web is complex. And it takes time to establish these relationships. I like this next figure that shows this succession. So on the left, you have like an agricultural system, which is a little bit simpler. And then you have this land use change, and you can see that it's starting to get more complex. And in a late succession season, you have more organisms and more complex organisms. And so it's a succession that's happening in the soil, and it can take longer to establish these complex relationships and these higher trophic level organisms to get established. So it's important as you're transitioning in from a more conventional or a system that has relied less on the biology of the soil to one that's really trying to promote that activity. That takes time and a few years. There's also the ecological health that can overall help to promote plant health on your farm. So in summary, we see this shift and focus to soil health for plant health as part of our disease management strategy in organics. So here's a summary of these practices that I've covered today. And I think of those as largely pathogen management. And we can bring together now these practices of soil health, soil armor, minimizing soil disturbance, plant diversity, continual live plant roots. And I've added number 5, which is feeding the soil. And that we bring these two together in organic practices. And that becomes really foundational to suppressing disease and promoting health in organic farms. So I hope that has given you a sense of how to approach disease management in organics. And if we have time, I will take some questions. Thank you.
Thanks so much, Margaret, for that great presentation. We'll go ahead and ask one question, and that is, there's so many things to think about when transitioning, including when transitioning and thinking about organic disease management. Is there one particular thing that you want folks in the room to remember? What is the most important thing that they should remember when thinking about organic disease management in the transition process?
Think about, if I can say two things.
Great.
Focus on plant health. Focus on getting irrigation right, fertility right, your planting calendar correct. Those basic agronomic tools are going to help suppress pathogens. And the second thing is establish basic disease management protocols. These are well established and kind of universal, as I mentioned. So use disease-free seed, keep your tools clean, etc.
Great. Thank you so much, Margaret, for that excellent presentation. We know that you have to leave at 1 p.m. today. I'm going to ask if people have additional questions for Margaret about disease management, go ahead and put them in the chat box. And Margaret, if you can take some time before you leave to answer any questions in the chat box, that would be helpful. But with that, awesome. Thank you. With that, we'll pass it over to Eric. So Eric should be showing up on your screen shortly. And Eric, please go ahead and share your screen. It's looking good here. And we can see your slide. Thanks so much, Eric.
Perfect. All right. There's a lot of stuff that I'm going to be covering on a lot of different topics, but it all ties back into integrated pest management, or IPM, for organic agriculture. And some of it Margaret has already covered, so there will be a little bit of repeating. But I'd like to sort of take a step back and think about IPM more broadly as a concept. I'll give you examples, but I also want to give you the philosophy and sort of the thinking behind it, because that will help you adapt it to your own situation. For IPM, there are many different definitions out there. One that I particularly like is from the UCCE Master Gardeners, and it says that IPM is an ecosystem-based strategy that focuses on long-term prevention of pests or their damage through a combination of management methods. And I think this is really good, but it is a little bit vague still, especially on what exactly you're supposed to do. And that shows up oftentimes because people can think they're doing IPM if they're just going out and they're scouting and then they're spraying. That could be classified as IPM, but it definitely doesn't feel like IPM. So with that in mind, let's think about what is good IPM. Let's take a step back and think about what we're actually trying to accomplish. And that's helped us to conceptualize what IPM is and how it is that we should be using it. And the way I like to think about it is from kind of an odd starting point. I wonder if any of you have seen this before. This is a picture from Through the Looking Glass, or also known as Alice in Wonderland by Lewis Carroll. And here, Alice is in Wonderland, and she meets this character called the Red Queen. And the Red Queen is explaining to her the rules of this strange land she's in. And the Red Queen tells Alice, here, it takes all the running you can do just to keep in the same place. And if you want to go somewhere else, you must run at least twice as fast as that. And this, I think, is a very vivid description of this world, but it also is actually something that applies in other areas. In fact, it shows up in biology, and it's known as the Red Queen hypothesis. And basically what this states is that it's an evolutionary theory where organisms must constantly evolve just to survive against other competing organisms. Basically, a consistent arms race is necessary just to survive. And this principle doesn't just apply abstractly in biology, it also applies to pest management very directly. Pests constantly adapt to our efforts to control them. And this is especially true if pesticides are the main control method that is being used. So this shows up in what is called the pesticide treadmill, where if you're only using pesticides to control pests, then you constantly have to use newer or more potent pesticides as time goes on because the pests are evolving resistance to the pesticides that you were previously using. So with this in mind, we want to avoid the Red Queen scenario as much as possible. It's impossible to completely avoid this scenario, but you don't want to get stuck running in place, constantly having to change what you're doing in order to just stay in one position. IPM is what helps us to avoid the Red Queen scenario and ultimately what helps us to control pests long term. So this is, I think, a very useful way to conceptualize what you're trying to do with IPM. You're trying to avoid this Red Queen scenario of being stuck running in place. And you can know that you are practicing good IPM when you are practicing knowledge-based pest management. What that looks like is you really understand your growing system, whatever it is, whatever crops that you are growing, and you get that system as much as possible to do the work for you, as opposed to you having to do all of that work. The more specific ways you do that are by making your management hard for pests to adapt to. Use a bunch of different techniques. Don't use just one. If you use just one, that leads to the Red Queen scenario, as we talked about with, say, pesticides. You also want to use techniques that are hard for the pests to evolve resistance to. For example, physically crushing an insect is really hard for it to evolve resistance to versus applying pesticides to it. And you also want to use techniques that adapt with the pests. They're the ones who are changing along with the pests. Things like biological control are a really good example of that. In other words, you want your management to do the quote unquote running for you, as opposed to you consistently having to change and do things differently. And all of this is really critical when it comes to organic agriculture. Good IPM is more important when you are growing organically. In other words, don't just do conventional management with fewer tools. If you're transitioning to organic agriculture, you have to change your mindset a little bit. You really don't want to have the exact same mindset, because then you're going to be stuck just with fewer tools and doing the same thing. You can also see switching to organic as an opportunity to implement better integrated pest management. So don't see it just as losing tools, but instead as this opportunity to actually do a better, more holistic job when it comes to pest management. Now, this is still a bit abstract, so let's talk about the IPM pyramid, where we get into the actual tools that you'd be using. This pyramid, the lower down you are on it, and the bigger the pieces on it, is indicative of the amount of effort and time you should be spending on that part of pest management. So at the bottom, where you should be spending the most amount of effort and time, is on identification, scouting, and monitoring. You need to know your pests, and you need to know when they are present. Next up, we have cultural control, prevention, and sanitation. This is something Margaret talked a lot about. These are preventative measures and some basic but very powerful control options. You'll do quite a lot of this in organic production. Next up is another thing that Margaret talked about, which is biological control. This is when you use beneficial organisms, both passively, by allowing the system to have biodiversity in it, and actively by actually bringing in these beneficial organisms. At the top of the pyramid, we have chemical control, because yes, pesticides definitely are a part of IPM as well, and they are also a part of organic IPM. And finally, up at the top, something that a lot of people don't usually have in this pyramid, but that I like to put in, is this idea of shifting your perspective. This is sort of an overall way that you change what you're doing in order to practice better IPM. Let's start at the bottom. Spend a little bit of time talking about some of the best tools for identification, scouting, and monitoring. This is a whole other presentation that I have worked up, so you're just going to get the very highlights of it. But basically, there's a number of different tools that I recommend for pest ID, because I get pictures like the one here. And people ask me, what pest am I dealing with? And I can't answer because it's too small to see. So you need good magnification oftentimes for good pest ID, both for yourself and for taking pictures, because taking pictures is really important if you want to send these off for assistance or to get help with your pest ID. There's a number of inexpensive and accessible options that I've looked into, and one of the best ones is this phone camera microscope. Strangely, it doesn't have a brand associated with it. That's bad marketing on their part, but if you look up phone camera microscope and look for something that looks like this picture, you'll basically find it. It's about $20 to $40. It clips onto your phone and it slides in front of your phone camera. It also has a built-in light source, so it's really easy to use. It's very small. You can carry it with you. And as an example of how it works, this is a picture of an insect on my hand. That's as close as I could get with my phone camera, and I have a pretty new and nice phone camera. But here's what it looks like looking through that phone camera microscope. Much better. You can actually tell, oh, this is an Ophidius wasp, which is actually a beneficial parasitoid and something that I want to have around. It's not a pest. It's actually one of those beneficials that is useful in biological control. So this is a really good option. I highly recommend basically everybody go out and get one of these, especially because it's so cheap and because it can just clip onto your phone. Other options include things like handheld digital microscopes. There's a number of different brands for these. They can sometimes connect to your computer, other times they're wireless. Overall, it costs about $200 for a decent model of these. My go-to rule of thumb is don't buy the cheapest one from any brand, but buy one up from the cheapest one. And that's usually a sweet spot where it's pretty good, but not too expensive. So that is also an option if you want to have something that magnifies a bit better than the phone camera microscope. If you do have a normal microscope, or if you have a hand lens, which hopefully you do have a hand lens, you can also take pictures through those as well. But once you have a picture with all of this, what about things like insect ID apps? Because we're not all experts on insects and we don't always have the ability to send it off to an expert easily. So what about those apps that can maybe help you ID things? I tested
Eric,
a whole bunch of them. Yeah.
Eric, sorry to interrupt you. I'm just going to ask you to slow down a little bit to help our interpreters out.
All right. We may have to skip a little bit. So I'll slow it down a bit. There's a bunch of insect ID apps that are available. The best one is Google Lens. That's kind of the end story if you want to be there. That's the best one to use. The rest of them, we'll just skip through very quickly. Some are built into the iPhone, like Visual Lookup. Picture Insect is a paid option, which is not so great, but these are okay. Seek by a Naturalist is not wonderful. And if you are looking for a bad insect identifier app, Picture Insect Identifier is terrible. Never use it. But something is missing from this that a lot of people use, and that is ChatGPT or other generative AI tools. I only tested ChatGPT. Overall, I would put it in the same category generally as Seek, so it's not very good. ChatGPT didn't give me great results, and it also sounded like an expert. So it sounded like it really knew what it was talking about, but it also wasn't very good at identifying insects. So keep that in mind because a lot of people now especially are using ChatGPT for lots of different things. If you want to have an insect ID app, Google Lens is the best overall. When you're using any of these, be skeptical and double check the results because even the best one like Google Lens is a useful tool, but not a reliable identifier. So those are some of the tools that you can use for insect ID and for magnification. What else should you be doing in scouting and monitoring? In this case, you should be thinking about pest thresholds. This is a really important part of integrated pest management. Basically, if you're looking at this graph on the y-axis, we have the number of pests that you might have on your crops. And on the x-axis, we have time. And you can see the pest population is slowly growing over time until it grows and grows and eventually reaches what we call the economic injury level. This is the point where pests are truly damaging your crops, causing you actual harm. They're causing you to lose money. You don't want to get to that point. So instead, you want to treat before you reach the economic injury level, and you want to apply treatments at the economic threshold, which is below that point, and that's the point at which you need to use these control measures to avoid reaching actually losing your crop, actually losing money. So again, you treat at the economic threshold. And good monitoring, good consistent monitoring is necessary in order to use this tool. The takeaway from all this, because it's kind of abstract, you need to know when pests will actually start causing you intolerable damage, and you need to use interventions to avoid reaching that point, but not before that point, because otherwise you're just wasting your money trying to control a pest population that isn't at a point where it's truly a big issue. Important things to keep in mind when you think about thresholds. Thresholds are often not established outside of major crops and major pests. Oftentimes, it's up to you to determine what is intolerable damage and when to treat in order to avoid it. That's especially true when you're dealing with specialty crops or if you are growing on a smaller scale. So this is a very good principle to have in mind, but oftentimes it's going to be up to you to determine what exactly all of those different points are. All right, let's move on to the section on cultural control, prevention, and sanitation. Prevention and sanitation are extremely important. A saying you may have heard is that an ounce of prevention is worth or is maybe even greater than a pound of cure. And that really is true when it comes to pest management. There's lots of different methods here, many of which Margaret already covered. Planting resistant cultivars, physically excluding pests by covering them, delaying planting or planting early in order to make sure your crop is not growing at the same time as a pest population is peaking, and of course, removing infested material so you don't have diseases or pests sitting around for long periods of time. Also, proper water and proper nutrient management is also a form of pest management. The healthier your crops are, the fewer pests they're going to have. And as an example that is more sort of in Margaret's field, but that I think is very relevant, is Phytophthora in avocado. Here, one of the best ways to manage it is using a bunch of these prevention and sanitation tools. So you start off by purchasing resistant rootstock and using that. You also don't want to over-irrigate because too much water often will lead to Phytophthora infections. And you also want to keep any infected water from moving to out of one part of the grove to another. So keep the infected water from moving, make sure it doesn't spread the disease. And applying mulch is extremely important, as well as applying gypsum also help reduce the rate of Phytophthora. So all of these are prevention and sanitation measures, but that demonstrate how you can help prevent Phytophthora in avocado. There are other types of cultural control as well, and these are mostly useful because they're so hard for pests to adapt to, and therefore they help you avoid the Red Queen scenario. You can physically destroy pests, whether that's tilling or hoeing them in or physically crushing them. You can wash them or knock them off of plants, which is very common if you have pretty small scale growing operations. Doesn't work so well if you're on a larger scale. Practicing crop rotation is important. Mulches are extremely useful as well and have many benefits. Reflective mulch is an option that a lot of people don't know about, but is a useful tool as well that helps prevent insects from finding your plants. Solarization and pasteurization are things that Margaret also mentioned. And trapping, you can do it on a mass scale. You don't only have to use it for monitoring. Let's talk now a little bit about biological control. This is a very powerful tool that is very useful in organic production. One form of it is conservation biological control, which you can see pictured in the background here. Basically, you're providing the necessary resources for natural enemies, those beneficial predators and parasitoids that help you keep pest populations in check. You're providing them pollen, you're providing them nectar, you're providing them a stable source of habitat, and you're also providing them alternative prey. And when you provide these things, then they can move into the nearby crops and start to control pests for you. There's many different examples for how you can do this. Establishing floral plantings in the margins of your fields, in alleyways, or in strips inside your actual crops can be beneficial ways to bring in these predators and parasitoids. If you're doing this, you oftentimes want to be planting primarily native flowers because they grow well in the area and help feed the beneficial predators that are already present. You want to plant many species, and you also want to plant flowers that bloom across the entire season so the resources are constant. Having things like hedgerows and windbreaks are useful in their own right, but if you plant them with multiple species, and especially with flowering species, this is also a way to practice conservation biological control. Mulching is useful in and of itself, but also increases habitat for ground-dwelling predators. Leaving nearby wild areas intact can also allow native beneficials to move into your crops. And planting diverse polycultures is another form of conservation biological control, where insects and other beneficials are able to use a whole bunch of different resources that are present all at once. Now, it's important to keep in mind that all of this provides a consistent baseline level of control, and it adapts in response to pest populations. So it is very valuable, but it's not great for controlling pest outbreaks that are already in progress. If you're trying to control pest outbreaks that are already in progress, you usually will have to use augmentative biological control. Augmentative biological control is where you release large batches of these natural enemies, and this sudden influx of predators or parasitoids knocks the pest populations back and helps you to manage them. A good example of this is with the mealybug destroyer. The scientific name is Cryptolemus montreusieri. It's pictured over on the right-hand side, and it will consume most mealybug species and is very good at reducing their populations. You can see in the background, I'm holding a container with several hundred of them that are being released in a citrus grove in Florida. Pathogens can also be used and are a form of augmentative biocontrol. These are commercially available, and they can often be applied in a similar way to conventional pesticides. There's lots of different examples of these: Bacillus thuringiensis, Bavaria bassiana, or a number of different entomopathogenic nematodes. These are all very useful and can target a range of different pest species. They do, however, require the correct temperature and the correct humidity for them to be effective, because they are alive. And so they need to be treated as such, and they need to have the conditions to survive. They are highly effective when they're used properly, and it is also a good way to transition more towards biological control. It's a good way that is kind of familiar for a lot of people, and it can be applied similar to conventional pesticides, so it's a good option if you are transitioning. Just note that pests can still develop resistance to tools like this, but it usually takes them a bit longer. All right, let's talk just very briefly about chemical control, because pesticides are a part of IPM as well. There's going to be lots of information. I'm sure most of you are more familiar with chemical control, but one thing that's important to remember is that biological control and chemical control can be compatible. They can be used at the same time, and that's especially true, generally speaking, of organic pesticides, which often have a shorter residual, which means they don't last for as long, and they tend to be more selective and therefore less harmful to other beneficial insects. Here is a table from the UC IPM website, which is looking at the relative toxicity of insecticides to natural enemies, both directly and then as a residual, so how long it sticks around. These ones in red are mostly the organic options. The ones below are all conventional, so they aren't things you'd be using anyways. And you can see, for the most part, they're not as toxic to predators and parasitoids. And that's good, but timing is definitely key when you're using this. And it's important to remember that it isn't always true that organic pesticides do not harm beneficials. They definitely still can. Spinosad is a very common insecticide that can be organic, that is used by organic growers, and it actually harms and kills syrphid fly larvae, which are very beneficial predators that help you control aphids, mealybugs, whiteflies, and psyllids. So timing is important, and understanding when to use them is also very important. All right, the last part of the pyramid is that very top section, which is talking about shifting your perspective. And this one's a little bit harder to do, but is actually, I think, one of the most important things to do. When I talk about shifting your perspective, growers of all kinds frequently live in the Red Queen scenario, running as fast as they can just to stay in the same place and getting exhausted and burnt out because of this. One of the best ways to get out of this scenario is to change your status quo, if you can. That's not always possible to do, but if you can, it is extremely impactful. Ways to do that are by thinking holistically and ecologically. You need to understand how your entire cropping system functions and all the different pieces of it, the pests, the crop plants, the beneficials that are trying to help you out. You need to understand all of the interactions between them. And when you do, you're much more likely to be able to get your system to do the running for you. As much as possible, and again, this isn't possible for everyone, try to accept some damage and some disorder in your cropping system. An example is things like thrips or broad mites that can cause cosmetic damage to things like citrus and avocados, as you can see pictured on the right hand here. The fruit is still perfectly fine. It just looks bad. And oftentimes that means we have to spend a lot of time trying to manage these pests when all they're doing is making the produce not look so good. Of course, there are reasons for that. Consumers want their produce to look good. We don't necessarily have control over that. But if you do, in your particular scenario, you can just avoid treating for these pests entirely. So accepting some damage and disorder, if you can, is very important. Additionally, try to bias yourself a bit more towards inaction. We often see a pest and we want to do something right away. Instead, watch and wait. And this will oftentimes let you learn more, and it also can allow you to let your system balance itself out more. So you have to ultimately do less to keep it running. And as much as possible, consider changing how you do things if you're running into pests over and over again. If you have consistent pest issues when you're growing one crop, maybe you should stop growing that crop. Again, if you can, and if that is feasible. And finally, the biggest thing, create a system that needs less from you as much as you possibly can. Because oftentimes we have systems that when we build them need a lot from us. They need our constant input. We want to create systems that need less from us as much as possible. And if we can do that, that's one of the ways to get out of or reduce our time and reliance in the Red Queen scenario. All right, with the little bit of time I have left, let's go through some quick examples of IPM with specific pests where all the steps are utilized. An example is with Asian citrus psyllid, abbreviated as ACP, and pictured on the right-hand side here. First, you need to be able to identify all life stages of Asian citrus psyllid if it's a pest you're dealing with. They're pictured over there. We don't have time to get into exactly how to ID them, but you do need to be able to know what they look like. You want to monitor for psyllids regularly, especially checking new flush on your trees, because that is where the psyllids are going to be congregating. A good example of this, if you have a decent sized grove, is looking at 10 trees on each side of your grove and 10 in the middle of the grove, and check 2 branches per tree for Asian citrus psyllids. That's how you'd go out and monitor for them. Consider establishing windbreaks at least 12 feet tall, because they prevent psyllids that are drifting on the wind from coming into your grove. You can also apply kaolin clay to the leaves, which helps prevent the psyllids from finding new flush in the first place. Prune and apply fertilizer in the spring or summer as opposed to applying it all throughout the year. This also makes it so your trees only flush at 1 or 2 times during the year, as opposed to flushing consistently. If they flush consistently, then there's more consistent food for the psyllids to find. Beneficial predators are important to keep around, and you can do this by planting flowers to attract these predators. Sweet alyssum is a good example that has been researched and found to work well. If you have little islands of alyssum, which are pictured in the background picture, every few trees, then this will bring in beneficial predators like these hoverflies, which will then feed on the psyllids if they are present, and will also feed on other pest insects that are there. You want to manage ants, because ants will farm these psyllids and protect them from predators and parasitoids. So manage ants by putting out boric acid bait stations, by considering wrapping your trees if the ants are particularly bad to keep them from going up into them, and mulch around the tree and cover your irrigation lines, because ants love highways and areas where it's easier for them to move. That's how they get to trees. So if you have mulch, it breaks up the ground and makes it harder for the ants to move. If you cover your irrigation lines, then the ants no longer have those highways anymore. And finally, apply insecticides if pest pressure gets too high, or if you're part of area-wide treatment zones, that can be the case for Asian citrus psyllid. Different options that can work are spinosad, pyrethrins, and oils. We have one more example we're going to go through pretty quick, which is with cabbage looper. So say you're planting cabbage or other brassicas, you need to be able to first, of course, identify all life stages of cabbage loopers, which are pictured over here. You want to monitor soon after seeding or transplanting because the cabbage loopers can show up early. An example for how you might do this is check 25 plants randomly all throughout your field, looking for these pests and for damage caused by them as well. Some rough thresholds for them. Again, it depends on your scale, but rough thresholds could be 1 looper per 5 young plants, and then as they get bigger, maybe 9 loopers per established plant. When it comes time for harvesting, it could be that 10% or so of them are infested at 2 to 3 loopers per plant. And in situations like this, it means you probably then want to be applying insecticides of some kind in order to knock them back. You want to manage nearby weeds like mustard because they can harbor these loopers and cause them to move into your nearby fields. You want to keep natural enemies around because they generally will help keep populations of the loopers down. You can do this by avoiding broad spectrum insecticides or also by doing some of the other methods for conservation biological control that we talked about. Basically down at the bottom, you would be using different insecticides like BT or Bacillus thuringiensis if you were reaching a threshold where you needed to apply something. And spinosad would also be a good organic option, especially because it affects other caterpillars as well. So even if you hadn't correctly identified this as cabbage looper, it could still be a useful tool. As I said, there was a bunch of information with all of that, and it doesn't cover all the different crops that you might be growing. So a good resource is the UC IPM website. It's ipm.ucanr.edu. I hope you've all been to it before. It really is a really good tool. Just remember that there are 2 different sections in it. We have homes and landscape, and we have agriculture. So you need to know where you are because it provides different information depending on which section you're in. Depending on the scale you're growing on, sometimes it actually is relevant to have both as well. And whenever you're looking at a page on a pest in particular, there is basically always a section on organic management options for each of those pests. So you can go to that section and see different tools that you can use, but of course, there's relevant information outside of that as well across the entire page. So again, this is an extremely valuable resource. I highly recommend you use it very often and you explore it because there's a lot more tools than you might think initially that are hidden a bit deeper in the website. So this is a really, really good tool. I highly recommend all of you use it, especially in a whole bunch of different contexts, and especially if you're trying to look at how to implement IPM better as you transition to organic. And that was the end of the presentation. My email is down there below, and I'd be happy to take any questions. I'll stick around for the next little bit as well.
Thank you. Thanks so much, Eric. If you want to learn more about our panelists, please look them up online. You can learn more about Margaret and Eric. We just want to say thank you to them again for sharing such great information with us. I wish we had 5 hours for this meeting. Next week, we'll be learning about organic weed management, hopefully with fewer technological issues. And then we're going to stay on for office hours. But this concludes the formal part of our webinar series.